So I'm kind of tethered to this spot here by the microphone and not wanting to trip over the wires. And also I've got my notes here. And then I've got also another computer going on. So I'm working between screens. You know, what could possibly go wrong? We'll see. Okay, so thank you ever so much for inviting me to be here today. I've really enjoyed sitting, listening to the discussions as they've been unfolding. Really interesting presentations. And I think a lot of what I'm going to be talking about will pick up on the themes that we've been discussing in ways that I hope will be really productive. And then, of course, we can have a discussion about those themes. And then I think we're moving into workshop mode then. So I promised not to speak for 45 minutes as scheduled in the program. I'm going to try and do it in kind of 35 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time to chat. So a little bit about who I am. My name's Jenny Kidd, and I teach at Cardiff University, or I lecture in Cardiff University in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture. And so I guess one of the things that's already been flagged up today is the fact that we might be coming from quite different disciplinary perspectives in this room and in our field. We very much do, and that's one of the great things about our field. But it does, of course, have a great impact on how we think about things like ethics and, of course, you know, everything else. We are kind of products of our environment in that way. And so, you know, I am also. So the kind of perspective that I come from very much is kind of media and cultural studies, which is kind of my background. And so I've really appreciated this opportunity to think a little bit more about digital ethics and how they play out in my own research, and indeed how I kind of perform my research then through the writing that I do as well. And what I'm hoping that this is not going to be a kind of undoing of my professional integrity over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. But I am going to talk a little bit about my own experiences with various different kinds of projects. And so I thought I would start with something of a reflection to get us going, get us thinking. So I wrote a book quite a while back now, actually, which uses as one of its bodies of empirical data a sample of social media communications that were being produced and shared by museums across a number of different profiles and across a number of different social sharing sites. I want to say that I scraped that data or that I used an API or something like that, but it really wasn't that way. It was much more kind of manual, painful, kind of drawn-out process than all of that at that time. And at that time, there weren't really that many of us who were working in this area of digital cultural heritage on those kinds of themes. And certainly, I was the only person in my university department at that time who was doing that kind of data collection and that kind of analysis. So looking back now on that process, my processes around that project, I cringe a little bit because our understanding of data collection, use, misuse, ethics, all of the things that we've been talking about over the course of today has since become so much more nuanced and so much more critical. And that, of course, is a really good thing. It is still imperfect, of course, but very much more nuanced than it was then. And so in preparation for doing this talk, I braved a critical reflection on my process in doing that bit of research, on how I had done it and how I wrote about that research in the book. And I've thought a lot about doing that kind of critical reflection on that work over the years. And I found myself really resisting doing that kind of reflective work, actually, and making space for doing that kind of reflective work. And so this was really quite a nice opportunity for me to kind of grapple with, okay, why is it that I'm so worried about doing that work? And what will happen if, you know, what will be the kind of real world consequences for me and my research if I take the time to do that kind of reflection? I talk a lot now with students and other researchers about our ethics within these kinds of spaces. But as I say, I have felt myself resisting reflection on that particular project, a little bit uneasy about where it was going to take me and who I might be as I came out the other end of it. But I decided for all of you lovely people, I was going to brave it and I was going to do it. And I sat down and I thought, right, okay, what was it I actually did? How did I approach it? And all the rest of it. So I sat down and I analysed my process against the current Association of Internet Researchers Ethics Guidelines as a way of trying to see whether what I did at that time would withstand scrutiny in 2019. And actually, that was fairly straightforward. I got myself a pass on that. I was like, okay, that I'm not going to worry too much about all of that. But then I realised that those guidelines had actually been written in 2012, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I need to look a little bit more further afield and see what I could glean from other kinds of disciplinary contexts. And so I looked to the 2017 British Psychological Society ethics guidelines, and I thought that I would, kind of run my research through those guidelines. Would my process withstand that kind of scrutiny, that kind of lens? Luckily, I'm pleased to report, it just about does. But I confess, actually, it's much more by chance than design, and this was the thing that I kind of wanted to think a little bit more about. So one of the key findings in that research that I did at that point in time was that museums were, on the whole, not really engaged in vibrant discussions with members of the public in social media spaces. So there wasn't really a kind of really dynamic set of, gorgeous tweets and whatever else that I could pull into, certainly the published, outputs from that research, whether that I could present visually. So it wasn't really the case that that stuff existed for me to use. If it had been there, I might have tried to do so. I might have been tempted to try and reproduce that in my outputs, but it really wasn't there for the most part. I didn't have access to things like IP addresses. I didn't store any information about profiles for members of the public. The threads could be considered public, and we can talk more about that kind of, public-private distinction and where and how we feel it collapses. And the museum posts couldn't really be considered to be by, vulnerable people by any kind of, ethical definition in the ethics discourse. The data that I analysed actually were on hard copy, and I've safely locked them away in my office, which has meant that I haven't had to worry too much about putting them in a repository, encrypting them, or protecting them from being kind of mashed together with other kinds of data. In another 3 years, I will be able to destroy all of that data, I suspect. So some of those things, I have to say, kind of hand on heart, I really didn't consider at the time. And of course, my ethics form that I filled in at the time didn't ask me to consider those things either. It probably would to some degree now, maybe when it comes to the data storage at least, but for the most part, actually, it would be a similar kind of a situation. So I breathed a sigh of relief on passing this test that I had set myself. Big old pat on the back, a big old sigh of relief. So what is going on here? So in reflecting on this, I began to think about, okay, well, what is it about this desire to be ethical or to be seen to be ethical, and what does all of that mean for us in terms of our kind of professional identities? I guess that desire is natural, and it's one that you all no doubt share here in this room. You care about this stuff. That's why you're here today. But it's patently not easy being ethical, and we've been hearing about that today. Our understanding of what is at stake in our ethics changes over time. And as we've also been hearing, there's a lot of growing up in public going on here as well. We're kind of making some of this stuff up as we go along. Especially, of course, this is the case when we're researching in digital contexts about which we are still learning. These kinds of contexts, they evolve, and they undoubtedly require new kinds of professional and data literacy from us as researchers. So I guess I should say something about my kind of positionality in all of this. Getting my defense in early. I'm not a moral philosopher, and I come at this very much, again, thinking about my kind of disciplinary context from what I've gleaned in digital media ethics, the ethics of technology, museum ethics, and of course doing research within digital heritage contexts, which I've been doing now for more than a decade. And I've been thinking about the ethics of doing research within digital contexts for longer than that, though, since the kind of early days of my own PhD research in 2002. So are these issues becoming more straightforward as digital media becomes sedimented within our everyday? Well, not in the slightest. We all know that. As we begin to use and ask questions about automated processes, immersive media, and more complex and dynamic kinds of participation in digital culture, our approaches will no doubt demand closer ethical scrutiny. Are the questions we're asking about all of this more interesting, informed, insightful, and intentional? Well, I think they are, actually, and I think we're seeing evidence of that today. So in my research more broadly, I tend to approach technologies as an open set of questions, problematic rather than as a given. And this is an approach that's advocated by Gerard Goggin. And I think approaching digital heritage ethics in the same way is, I think, fruitful. Ethics as a problematic, not as something that's a given, something unsettled, uncertain, and precarious. Questions that don't have prescribed answers. And this, of course, is not out of step with the broader ethics discourses that we're no doubt becoming familiar with. We're increasingly understanding, say, museum ethics as situational, negotiated, and contingent, thinking about the work of Janet Marstein in this area. And another text that I really like is a text by Jenny Hughes, who is of the University of Manchester, I think she's still at the University of Manchester, and who writes in the context of applied theatre studies. She does work in sites of conflict and in prisons. And of course, you can think about the work that happens in museums around applied theatre as well. And Jenny Hughes talks about research ethics as practice in itself and as a thing that can be practiced. And I really quite like that way of thinking about ethics. Part of a creative process and not something that stands outside of it and interprets, classifies, and defines. Jenny Hughes highlights the importance of what she calls improvisation and decomposition in our performance of our research ethics. So she talks about improvisation, how we negotiate ethics in the unplanned moments of research. We all, have done that, I'm sure. And decomposition, making visible those moments in research when encounters confound or delay or surprise or prevent or disrupt. And I'm sure we've all had experience of that as well. So I've been thinking more and more about all of these principles. And I think, and we've already kind of alluded to this idea of ethics as a thing then that we kind of, perform in environments like this. In the moments of research and in our research outputs also. So to digital cultural heritage research then, and being ethical in our methods, what are the kinds of things that I think we should be thinking about? We are thinking about these things. We've been talking about them over the course of today, and these were just some of the things that I thought that I would kind of highlight, and I think, they really kind of refract some of the discussions that we've already been having. So just to say something about digital heritage practice, I think this, and I've alluded to it already, the interdisciplinary nature of digital heritage research, I think has produced a really interesting research field. It ranges far and wide in its subjects, objects, theoretical frameworks, and its approaches. And I think that's really exciting, but really challenging for us all to kind of, get our heads around and to kind of, maintain in our own discourses. So we create practice, we observe processes, we explore dialogues, we find patterns, measure impacts, work collaboratively, co-produce, co-design, conceptualize, theorize, reflect, and document. Some of what we do is socially conscious, some is politically motivated, and none of it is neutral. There is by now a burgeoning literature on digital ethics to which we can connect our thinking and our research design. So, for example, Herman Tavani's work on technology and ethics is really helpful in beginning to think through the parameters of debates about digital ethics, encouraging attention to a number of kind of high-level themes, such as, and we've heard about these today, intellectual property, privacy, surveillance, security, accessibility, voice and silence, identity, and the realities of operating within converging systems. So that's Herman Tavani's work, which is really useful. We've seen increased interest in deep questioning around data ethics, data justice, and data harms. And so here I wanted to highlight the work of Lena Denchik, who's a colleague of mine, Anna Hintz and Joe Cable, and also Joanna Redden and Brand, who talk about data justice, data harms within the context of the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University. And if you're interested in those themes, I'd encourage you to take a look at the work that they've been doing. So we're beginning to kind of connect what we do with these kinds of debates as well, which I think is really interesting. So let's think then a little bit about digital heritage research harms then and what those might look like. And so there are a couple of threads, they're kind of related threads that I want to kind of pull on with all of this. And those are, and again, we've started to talk about these over the course of the day, platform politics, inequality, and dynamics of power as they're revealed in our ethics and in the research that we do. Our uses of data, the bias in our questions and the way that we frame our research problems, and then ethics codes and processes. So firstly then, thinking about platform politics, inequality, and the dynamics of power. And again, you know, we've started to talk through some of these issues, and we can chat more about them in the discussion. But just to kind of, you know, race through some of the issues that we might want to think about here. So whether bespoke or proprietary, the platforms that we research, those that we create, and those that we use to store our data are, of course, not neutral. And the choice of one over another will be consequential to the kinds of research that we want to do and the kinds of discussions that we want to have with our communities of interest. Platforms come with embedded logics, as we've been hearing, and norms with regard to the modes of communication, patterns of play, and often implicit permissions, all of which can alter over time and which we need to be aware of. That so many, say, social media platforms have their origins in startups with Silicon Valley mentalities should, and increasingly does as a society, give us pause for thought. Individualism and the free market underpin much digital development in that context, rather than ambitions towards social justice or democracy. And this, of course, impacts then the look and feel of those sites and who uses them. As Maria noted on Twitter the other day, it impacts how we think about and measure the value of those contributions. I think you were talking about Instagram, a really astute way of thinking about that. Our choice of platforms, programs, hosts, and networking tools at all stages of our research thus demands careful consideration and, where appropriate, then defence. Standing and Standing in their exploration of the ethics of crowdsourcing, which is of course relevant here, and we've been thinking a little bit about that today. It is one of our approaches. So Standing and Standing encourage us to think about the relational when it comes to our ethics, the dynamics of power that are revealed or often obscured in the work that we do. So in our case here, that means paying attention to struggle and contestation, and reminds us to consider how our research interacts with its contexts, whether institutional, social, cultural, political, or temporal. Recent discussions about how, for example, bias in algorithms shapes our experience of the web have been met in some quarters by surprise and rebuttal. But such biases are really consequential for us as researchers also. They mean that some voices are amplified and others are silenced. They mean some feel able to participate and others do not. They mean that as researchers, we only ever capture some voices. As such, they must raise questions for us about the forms of knowledge that are created as a result. And that's true whether we're researching in social network sites via a crowdsourcing tool or asking people to interact with bots or something like that. There are other related questions about how we refer to our participants and the spaces for exchange that we produce in our research, about our sense of ownership over those spaces, the language we use, and how these are shaped by our institutional and other cultures. So these are then at their core questions of power. Operating within the digital environment is difficult, if not impossible, to depoliticize, and we need to kind of be live to that. So what then about our uses of data? So our ethics policies, and we've talked a little bit about those over the course of the day, are largely designed to work for research projects generating new data, not those that use data that exist already out there in the world, and that by extension we have no control over. But when we research in online and social media contexts, much of what we do is working with data that have a social life of their own. The linkages made, the way they circulate, how they resurface, when they disappear. With the encouragement to archive and open up our data for future uses, again, we lose some of our control over that stuff again. It can then be linked to other data sets, or perhaps even in future reverse engineered, for example, so that contributions are no longer anonymous. So we need to think about that. We also need to think about, as we've seen, how we're differentiating between public and private. These are not just legal distinctions, as we've noted. The Association of Internet Researchers guidelines, although from 2012, are really super helpful in thinking through those issues. And there's a burgeoning literature on those kinds of themes that we need to be consulting in order to justify and, again, perhaps defend our decision-making. We should also consider that, as Francesco D'Orazio has asserted, social media data is not quantitative data, but qualitative data on a quantitative scale. A lot of it is discursive, contingent, or consists of pictures, not text. Turning it into big data thus has ethical consequences. So recent geopolitical developments have catapulted debates about data justice and data harms onto the agenda. And we cannot consider that our uses of data sit outside of those critiques. We've become comfortable in our assumption that researchers and indeed museums tend to operate outside of the commercial imperative. But how can those distinctions be maintained? I mean, we only have to look around us at HE at the moment, and it encourages us to kind of critique that assessment. Many of our considerations about data and its uses can be informed by our own perspectives as users of those services ourselves, although bearing in mind that our perspectives are not universal. Thinking from that perspective as a user can help us to reflect more fully on the implications of shifting data from social spaces to the spaces of research, and allows us to position our research with what Nissenbaum terms contextual integrity, which I think is a really interesting term. But not everybody, of course, has that insight. Indeed, many of us don't understand the sites, programs, algorithms, and the like that are at the center of our research inquiry, although often invisibly so. As Woodfield and Ifofen remind us, many research methods lecturers, research supervisors, research commissioners, and research ethics review committee members do not feel adequately equipped to make rounded, informed decisions about the quality, ethics, or value of social media research projects and proposals. And we might say that that, of course, extends beyond just, social media projects. We can't know and understand everything. But I think it is a problem if we're not able to reflect on gaps in our own understanding and how they might colour our own interpretations and our interactions that we have within our research projects. So this links then to another of the threads that I want to pull at, which is about the way we frame our research problems. As with all research, the way that we frame our research problem and the way that we set out to explore it contains assumptions. For example, much digital heritage research assumes that the digital can be unpicked and it can be held up for analysis. As such, it's not uncommon to see projects create what I would say is maybe a false dichotomy between the digital and the physical, the virtual and the real, the online and the offline. So we try to isolate the digital and hold it up as an object of study because it's the thing of most interest to us, and we don't connect it to the everyday real-world context of its use. Most of us live in a kind of hybrid reality these days anyway. We struggle to disconnect and are never wholly online or indeed offline. We talk about digital experiences as immaterial, ignoring their material and environmental reality. Server farms, digital detritus, those piles of dead technology in my office. There are moments of friction where I'm very conscious of the distinctions there, but there is also great porosity too, and all of that I think is really interesting to explore. Jason Farman notes that locating oneself simultaneously in digital space and in material space has become an everyday action for many people. And I think we need to adopt approaches to our research and our ethics that acknowledge and recognize that and that kind of, seek to explore that. So the questions that we ask are informed by our agendas, our ambitions, our worldviews, and the implications of that fact are consequential for the kinds of participation we engender and the data that we produce. This is true also for the kinds of conclusions that we arrive at and the way that we feel about how our research connects with wider cultural, social, political, or other developments. And so I thought I'd use here an example from my own research. So together with a company, and some of you will have heard me talk about this project, but maybe not from this perspective, But with a company called Yellow Brick and National Museum Wales, I've been working recently on building and launching an immersive storytelling experience, which is called Traces. I say recently, it kind of launched in 2016, but we've still been working on it. Even at that point, when we launched it in 2016, we'd been working on that project for quite some time. And what we wanted to do in that project was to play at the boundary between fact and fiction at the St Fagans site, which is part of National Museum Wales, and to make processes of museum and heritage making more visible to visitors. We wanted them, in this experience, to ask questions about the kinds of truths that museums construct and to blur the edges of those somewhat, that kind of distinction between fact and fiction in the museum context. But we weren't prepared for how our research agenda would end up positioning Traces as an intervention, however. Because, of course, since that time, we've had Trump and Brexit and debates about alternative facts and doing away with expertise, being post-factual. We didn't sign up to be a part of that, I have to tell you. And so I found myself in conferences and in other kinds of contexts saying things in relation to Traces and our ambitions, which against that broader context, I began to find really quite problematic and actually unhelpful. It felt a bit like our ethical stance on this project was unraveling. Was now a responsible time for this approach of ours? This was this question that we started mulling over. So we had to think long and hard about our response to that question and to define and to find a defence for our approach that we stand by and still do. And that is, why should our intervention, part fact, part fiction, be considered any more problematic than any other museum interpretation, just because we acknowledge from the start and we're open about that blurring that we're trying to achieve? We no longer accept the premise that it should require more robust defence than any other methodology. But that process of decomposition, to use Jenny Hughes' term, was really important to us as a research team. And it made us think in much more sophisticated ways about the work that we were trying to do with Traces and how the experience itself should be framed. But it's been a journey, I can tell you. Natasha Whiteman notes that the achievement of ethics is a messy and complicated business. And I really felt that with this project. What we achieved was not the ethical stance, but an ethical stance. And you might have arrived at a different kind of a place, and that's okay. So the questions we ask, how we identify our units of analysis, how we find those we wish to talk to, how we build things, see the book Algorithms of Oppression, and how we talk about our findings, none of those things is neutral. And I think I'd like to see us talk more openly and authentically about that. And of course, we've been doing that today. So lastly then, on to ethics codes and processes. I know you've all been waiting for this. This is exciting stuff, ethical codes. Aaron, I know you really think they are, but they are. they are. Okay. So this is really a thread then about whether our current ethical codes help us to do good work in these spaces or not, whether you're looking at museum codes or university codes. So I remember the very day that I started to question the efficacy of university ethics systems. I was part of a research team looking at the responses of audience participants to a particularly unruly and performative museum project. We had our ethical approval in place, that had been no problems, and we were dutifully handing out our consent forms to those that we were interviewing, observing, and on occasion filming as they took part in this experience. I was really struck that day that what we were doing was itself something of a performance of our ethics that most of our respondents were completely uninterested in. You know, they were not bothered in the slightest. And I was like, well, why are we clumsily handing out these forms and having these really quite strange interactions with people? And of course, the answer was ostensibly to protect those audience members from harm and to protect ourselves and the reputation of the academic institution that we represented. So I knew that in my rational mind. But it seemed to me that much more consequential were the kinds of ethical decisions that we were making moment by moment as we were out there doing that research. To interview this person rather than that person, whether or not to believe someone when they told us that they were over 18, how to respond appropriately to unanticipated revelations from our informants, and how and when to extract ourselves from contexts that might have been making us feel uncomfortable or even unsafe. And those sorts of things did, of course, happen. At a later date, my cynicism became more firmly entrenched. Sitting in for a colleague at an ethics committee meeting, I made the, I thought, quite banal point that although prior planning is important, many ethical decisions are made in the moments of doing field research. That seemed to me to be quite a straightforward consequence of researching with people in contexts where liveness and unpredictability were part of the research problem that were being investigated. And of course, many of our museum projects, are live, unpredictable kinds of environments. So my assertion in this meeting was met with confusion and derision. Apparently, all ethical problems can be predicted and they can be dealt with before a researcher even steps out of the door. That seemed to me to be quite a startling logic, and still does. And since that time, I've made a point of having discussions with research students about the many realities of research in live and unpredictable environments. And we can include online, offline, and the many hybrid spaces in between. And I've been encouraging them to embrace openness and reflexivity on these themes. And of course, today we see that that is happening more broadly. Perhaps then we are in a moment, a new moment for ethics, the undoing of ethics, according to Whiteman, or a moment of ethics rupture. This book is brilliant, The Ethics Rupture. If you're interested in these themes, do take a look at it. Are we in that kind of a moment? Perhaps. Having listened to the presentations today, I think that many of us in this room would agree with some statements from that book, The Ethics Rupture, that researchers are not neutral and that all research does harm. But to some people, and we all know some of those people, these are still startling provocations. Those who are invested and interested in current systems of ethics review and the cultures that they engender, what Adler and Adler call the panopticon of compliance. We might take issue with those systems, the broad increase in ethical scrutiny and surveillance, mission creep that we might see happening alongside those processes, questions about who gets to decide what being ethical means, debates about the appropriate terminologies for the researched, the Eurocentricity and monolingualism of our ethics discourse, and the persistence of the biomedical model as the default research approach from which all others are seen to digress. But should we do away with those systems entirely? Are they beyond recuperation? I don't think a dismembering of those systems is helpful or likely. Perhaps instead we can disrupt or rupture them from within. There are some suggestions in the ethics rupture for how we might do that. So people talk about including potential participants in the process of ethics review, for example, sharing our applications with each other, joining the ethics committees and championing the kind of work that we do within our institutions. All of those things might be important. But most importantly, I think, we need to commit to and sustain a path of self-reflection on ethics in research, and this is something that we started to discuss earlier. And I think also writing that into our outputs and our analyses is also important. It seems that, to me, that's the only way really of giving us confidence in our own judgment so that we might move beyond a state of stagnation on these issues. Ethics, as I noted at the outset, is something I think we should all be practicing, and reflection should be an important part of that practice. So some closing thoughts. I love this slide. If you do a Google image search for ethics, this is what comes up, and it's like, oh, if only I'd known it was that easy. Okay. So I've pulled a couple of threads there in the presentation. I could have said more. I haven't really talked about surveillance or data security or IP. I haven't said much about practices of immersion or those where we seek to manipulate particular kinds of outcomes, feelings, actions, or other kinds of impacts. We might want to think about the ethics of those kind of practices. I haven't solved anything. I perhaps haven't put any of your woes to bed. I may have made you feel more anxious about ethics. What I've tried to do through opening up those themes and rehearsing some of my own moments of performance, improvisation, and decomposition in relation to ethics is to make the case for reflection and practice in relation to our research ethics. Okay, this might make you feel better. There is nothing any more troublesome, I don't think, about researching in the digital environment than researching in any other environment. Not least because that's ceasing, I think, to be a meaningful distinction in many cases. Digital heritage is in and of the world and unremarkable in societies where digitality is embedded in our everyday. Ethical questions are tricky. They don't have clear answers, and distinctions between right and wrong are elusive, of course. But what's key for me is not answering those questions definitively. The answers will differ by context and will certainly change over time. But I think what's important is making ongoing attempts to explore them with care and reflexivity, as we are all doing in this room. Making decisions about ethics has become a daily part of doing digital heritage research. We recognise that ethics is an important part of our professional training and our practice, but our commitment to it can vary. And I think we should be willing and eager to commit to being ethical. In doing so, I think that we can position digital heritage researchers at the heart of a more dynamic and reflexive research practice, one that really is focused on the human rather than the utilitarian, that's bottom-up, open, socially responsible, and also just. We can hope. And I just thought I would end with some questions which we might want to use as a kind of a segue into some of the discussion over the course of the rest of the day. But that's it from me.
Thank you.
How did I do for time?
That's really great, yeah. So we have a roving mic. Who wants to go first? Well, I want to start. I really agree with that we have to be more reflexive about this in practice. But how does one go about being more reflexive in practice? And then how do we help then our ethic boards to help us be more reflexive?
Yeah. So I think we talked about it earlier, making time, carving out time, which is so hard because we're all time poor. But one of the ways that I've really found helpful to think about reflexivity is to try and write it into my writing, because we can very often, those of us who are lucky enough to work full-time for institutions and have space and time to do writing, we can easily justify taking the time out to do writing. So I've tried to start doing that. And also making space for conversations with others who are researching in the same space. And here we are today having those conversations, but they don't happen as often as we might like. And I think the fact that when we're researching digital heritage, the fact that we come from quite different disciplinary contexts and that we don't all go to the same conferences and all of the rest of it can mean that those discussions are difficult to make happen or to prioritize. But increasingly, I'm just trying to force myself to make that time and space. And in terms of ethics boards, I have never had a problem getting a project past an ethics board. I don't tend to do a lot of work with children. I guess that would flag up something somewhere that would mean they would pay more attention to me. So most of the time, I don't have any problem from ethics boards. I can fill in the forms, get through those processes. That's not a problem. I'm not doing anything that they think is ethically contentious. That doesn't mean that I'm not doing anything that's ethically contentious. So then it becomes that process of sitting and thinking and reflecting and being open and honest and transparent. And so it seems to me that often it's after you've done the ethics board approval that the process of really thinking about your ethics can begin. Is that, I don't know whether others feel the same. Yeah?
Yeah. I guess I'd like to build. I guess I'd like to just mention about transparency, just build on what you're saying there, because I guess that's the question. Taking your question to another level is how do you document transparency? And in such a way that it can be shared and become a thing we reflect upon, but don't overanalyze that we get ourselves caught in this web of, we can't do anything. So that's a question I'd just like to pop out.
Yeah, transparency. Again, I think writing into our research and making space, I would hope that we could have outputs from this kind of a discussion that would be, open, not hidden behind paywalls, that we would, but I also, I guess, something I was thinking as you were talking is that transparency and being able to write this into your research is something, again, that kind of maybe comes at a point in time where you are given the kind of permission to do that kind of writing, or I don't know, maybe that's an easy thing to say once you're publishing and, all of the rest of it. So I don't know that right from the off, everyone can be expected to do that kind of work or to write it in. I don't know. That's a really messy answer, but I'm acknowledging the privilege of being in a position to take time and to write and to ask those questions and to open myself up to scrutiny, perhaps, in a way that other people might feel they're just not able to do, or that scrutiny is going to come in different kinds of forms or whatever else. So at the same time as I want to argue for that kind of openness and reflexivity and transparency, I guess we need to see the privilege in all of that as well. That wasn't really an answer, but I think transparency is, it's important, but I can understand why it might not always be forthcoming.
Thanks. And I suppose, again, this isn't a question, but more of a bringing together the past two things that have just been said, that as researchers who maybe don't feel like our institutional ethic boards prompted us to think about the right questions, and being in a place where we are writing about research, perhaps it needs to become practice in what we do, that we explicitly do have to talk about ethics when we write up, and make that concerted effort to do so, to kind of start this practice of it being more embedded in almost like a formulaic way of us writing about our research, even though I don't want to make it formulaic. Well, I like standards and formulas, but yeah.
And I mean, being in communities where you can have those conversations and arrive at a kind of shared, maybe not consensus, but a sense of what the important things to consider might be, is something that people can work towards. But that assumes consensus is possible, and we already know that we might all have very different ideas about what is and isn't the right way of approaching a project, which isn't to say that one is ethical and the other is unethical. They might both be ethical, they might both be unethical. But yeah, I mean, you're not always going to find that kind of agreement. So I don't know that more sets of guidelines or more codes is where we want to go, but there are loads of texts that can help us think through all of this if we want to prioritize it. But I think you really have to want to prioritize it, given that very often our ethics boards are not going to encourage us to do that kind of work. Supervisors should be pushing for it, for sure.
Thanks. I think transparency is really interesting, kind of coming back to that. And I guess the experience you shared about having used these consent forms and where that felt like it was not the right way to go about this. I guess I thought, in a way, consent forms are kind of the standard approach to transparency, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Isn't that's where you say what you're doing and why, and you have people consent. And I guess my question is, since that, having had that experience, have you kind of explored other ways of being transparent in those kinds of settings that maybe are more effective than using the forms that were frustrating in that case?
I guess I've moved towards a different way of doing research from kind of that, okay, I'm in the moment and I'm trying to get people to comment or respond. For the most part, the kinds of research that I do now involve focus groups or user testing and approaches like that, where you can have a much more kind of a transparent and laboured discussion about what it is you're trying to do and what your research questions are and what you expect of people and all of the rest of it. And one of the other things that we kind of touched on a bit earlier and that we were talking about before the break is payment. And actually a lot of the research that I do now, I pay people to take part in. And again, I'm in a situation where I can get funding from projects or whatever else to enable that to happen. And I think the minute you're handing over money, people, there is a moment there where you can kind of have those conversations and you have somebody's attention. We're not always going to be able to do that, but I have found that a really fruitful way of having conversations about and facilitating research interactions. And of course, again, you have to be transparent about that because that changes. It's a different kind of a transaction and all of the rest of it, but we can be open and reflexive about that in the way that we write about that research.
Sorry, I've got a question. Well, actually, I don't know what that is.
And other people may well have thoughts and responses to these questions. So do open it up.
Saturation. So one thing that I feel I've experienced with doing action research from a different perspective to the one that I did before, is saturation of going to communities, and this might be something you can kind of add to as well, but going to communities where lots of researchers have perhaps been before, but not being always aware of how frequently that group of people or communities of people have perhaps had interaction or an experience of a researcher. And so I don't know whether I'm just super sensitive, but I do definitely feel I have that imposter syndrome. I definitely feel a lot of a rise in anxiety if I feel people have been used, for research rather than so not just consent, it kind of there's got to be a more than consent form. Just from my perspective of saying, I respect where you're all at, and if at any point, we do have that. If at any point you want to pull out, fine. But I think it's more it's more, I don't know whether it's just a hurdle I've got to get over, but that feeling of, oh right, I now come with the researcher label, and it's just an interesting experience to have when you think, oh gosh, these, you kind of end up going, oh, poor people, and you kind of think, oh, I don't even know whether that's the right way to see it either.
I think that point about saturation is really interesting, and so I think about in universities, our students, and how often we're asking them to fill in forms and to, give us feedback on this, that, and the other. It's a real problem. So I'm sure there are people who are thinking that through in relation to particular groups and communities, and you're nodding at the back, and it may be that you have some experience of that. But I think the really important thing is that you're asking these questions and that you're kind of aware enough to, and it's about all of those discussions about harm and benefit and, why am I really going in there and asking these questions? Has somebody else already asked these questions? Why am I doing it again? Or, or am I coming from a different perspective? And if I am, why should these people be interested in that, that perspective? So I think it's asking all of those questions in the first instance has got to be the one way in. But I don't know if others have thoughts on that when you had your hand up.
But it's a kind of a trajectory away from what you're saying. So.
But it may be something that we come back into in workshops. I don't have an answer for that. But we've just got to be live to the fact that we very well may be asking an awful lot of the people that we're working with, and what kinds of transactions are we having, and how are they being compensated, if at all.
Can I just quickly come in on that? I don't think I need the mic. But I think it's the same in the museum sector as well.
Yeah.
The museum sector goes out and consults with communities a lot. And a lot of those communities, well, when they say community, it's generally one or two people who represent an entire community, and they became a key contact, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and they give so much of themselves as well. So maybe the museum, it's not just as individual researchers in academic institutions, but more widely that idea of saturation across our cultural heritage institutions needs to maybe be addressed, rather than it primarily being the university and researchers in universities that have to think explicitly and only about that.
And what, if anything, changes for those people as a result of, taking part in those kinds of projects? Do they see a kind of real structural, representational change in the institution that they feel, okay, something actually changed here and I was listened to? Or is that not so much the case? Yeah. And there's, no hard and fast answers to that.
Wasn't the question, was more trying to pull some threads together. I was thinking of Harold's comment about whether we should be accountable, and looking at your last point about museum, we, I suppose, as researchers in this area, and your last point about museum and heritage professionals that enjoy a lot of trust as well, both academics, researchers, and heritage professionals, I suppose, to have the moral high ground somehow and do this righter or better. And I don't know, I find it's very useful to be in an environment like this where it's more constructive to just share our concerns, I suppose, and our uneasiness. I'm not so sure how we can, if it's productive to move in a more regulatory capacity. It makes me a bit uneasy of when we feel others and ourselves haven't maybe done it right. And, when we all acknowledge that actually ethical committees very rarely touch on the really interesting things. I suppose it's about how can we take this forward in a useful and constructive way on things that are so tricky to do just right and wrong kind of answers, where it's so much more grey in between, I think. So it's just my uneasiness, I suppose, kind of sharing rather.
Yeah, we all have our uneasiness. Did you want to make a point, comment, question? You had your hand up before, I know, and then we kind of moved on around the room.
Maybe I'll kind of try to artificially segue that into this question, which is about traces and about how that kind of you found yourself in this kind of different political climate where you started out. And so I'm curious about how you dealt with that, because on the one hand, right, that would present opportunities to have an easy conversation. On the other, it can expose a community of people who are addressing something, that their work becomes something in a different context. And obviously, when you're a lot of times in online situations, that's very easy, and we see kind of happening. So I kind of was curious about your experience of that shifting kind of context and how you dealt with it.
Yeah. Yeah, because it was something that, so we went into the project and we were like, okay, let's explore this kind of, this, point at which the things we know and the things we don't know and the things we might make up and, artistic composition can kind of, come together in an output. And so we went to conferences and we were talking about traces, and we used these terms, truth, fiction, have fact, fiction. And they seem to be like real red flags. So one of the things we did was we changed our language for talking about what we were doing. So so don't use the word truth and don't use the word fact. And then it was like all of a sudden we could actually explore what we wanted to with nuance and people's understanding. But we were getting this sense that the language that we were using in certain kinds of contexts was a real red flag. And that was really interesting. And so that's that point about how we framed traces, which is actually a really quite gentle and not that provocative at all project. But there was something about the way we were framing it that was really provocative to people. And it was like, okay, so your point earlier about framing. So if we change the framing and we were kind of doing that retrospectively, and again, we can be kind of open about that. It made a massive, massive difference to the way that people understood what it was we were trying to do. And then we had a whole bunch of discussions about, okay, well, why had we gone in with those terms in the first place? And so, it enables different kinds of conversations to happen, and the nuance of your approach to, be explored. And we were working in a really productive and open partnership, so we were able to have those conversations. And I know that's not always the case. But yeah, for us, it really came down to language, I think. So it was quite a straightforward thing in the end to deal with. And we wrote about it. So we wrote a paper which was up online and people were responding to. So we've been very open about what we've done with it, there's been some really interesting discussions. Does that? Yeah. Help?
So, thank you so much. There's one more question.
Just really randomly, I'm just curious to know if anybody that has talked or anyone in the room is looking to be on an ethics board at their university.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Be the change, people. Be the change.
Is anybody actively
on it?
Are we currently seeking places where we could be on the board?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
Is it, would we not run from the position when? I think I'm one of those strange people that I would love to be I sit on the ethics committee for 2 professional organizations because I like being in the middle of that. I like seeing what people are doing and getting in the mess of what they're talking about. But I understand that a lot of people don't like that, and then it can be, being in that position can be quite confrontational. You're dealing people come at the ethics process from a very confrontational view, where it might be the thing that's going to keep them from doing the research they want to do. So yes, I think it's important to have people in those positions who want to be in them, not like your university, your institution said, there you go, you've got to do your service component and you're going to do it on the ethics board. That's not the person that you want to have there. Because you don't want someone who's going to come at someone else's research confrontationally. It should be a welcoming process of you've come, here's your research that you want to do. Here's what you've identified as potential issues in your research. How can we work with you as as an entity to help you do the best research that you can do? That's what the process should be. And whether that means creating more guidelines or less guidelines, I think that can be quite institutionally bound as well. So it's all about relationships.
Yeah. And going in with an open mind and not being reviewer too. Yeah.
Well, thank you
Thank you
so
all.
much. Yes.